Le vent fait pleurer mes yeux et je cavale pour me réchauffer. Ce climat-là n'est pas pour moi.
Editors vary enormously in terms of what they think translation is. And there are editors certainly who still believe that of any given book, only one translation is possible. They could have given it to anyone, and the same translation would have resulted from that. I'm here to tell them this.
You might as well use the cheapest.
Yeah, absolutely. So you might as well use the cheapest. I'm here to tell them this is simply not true. I can only give them a version. And while some of it will be limited by certain things that I might or might not know about a culture, it will de facto be an interpretation of what the book is.
This is a very unusual event, and one that I really welcome, because it was an event where, rather than talking to a panel of writers, the translators were taking centre stage.
If you translate, as I do, from Spanish, and that includes Iberian Spanish, Argentinian Spanish, Colombian Spanish, Cuban Spanish, there are so many different cultures, even within each of those countries, within those languages. There's no way anybody can make, what is a culture? We could be here all day. But obviously translation is not a matter of just words. It is a matter of understanding where these words are coming from.
Usually the translator is invisible, they get acknowledged in the book, but very rarely get their name on the cover put forward. So I really welcomed the LRB's decision to actually have a panel of translators talking about their role in the process.
I have never been to Angola. I would love to go to Angola. I have not yet been invited, but I'm at an advantage only because my Angolan writer is alive and on email, which means I can send him these kind of persecuting questions at 4 o'clock in the morning, asking him to explain things that he takes for granted. Even a story which is not about this culture, all of the little details, not only linguistic details, but also the way people eat and the way people move and the way buildings relate to other buildings in space or whatever. These are all things which he completely takes for granted, and I have no idea.
If you happen to be translating someone who writes in what was not his or her native tongue, you can get a very interesting insight into their original culture, and that has happened to me twice, quite recently. Sasha Stanisic, how the soldier, who was Bosnian-born, came to Germany without a word of German, and 2 decades before him, Rafik Shami, whose big historical 20th century Syrian novel is just out, came to Germany in the early 70s without a word of German. And they both must have soaked up the language, incidentally, like a sponge, because their vocabulary is that little bit wider than that of a native-born German writer, which is an odd thing. And I've noticed it with originally Turkish German writers, too. I think these writers are so open to the language and culture of their new countries, while also looking back at their old cultures, that you can have a little bit of double insight.
Well, you also have languages which are secondary languages in the country. I've translated both North African Arabic writers, but also the great West African writer Amadou Kourouma, where, as a French reader reading them in French, you have already got a sense of an alien culture. They are not using French in the same way. They don't use it to mean the same things, and the rhythms and cadences of it are completely different. I'm then, at some level, translating the French, but I'm also attempting to translate something that was already alien to begin with. When I did Allah is Not Obliged, which was Kourouma's last novel, actually I found that there were lots of resources. I went to Human Rights Watch, who sent me cassette tapes of both English and French testimonials from child soldiers, so that you could listen to them and actually hear the way they spoke and how they did it. Otherwise, you would have ended up translating into some sort of vernacular that made it seem as though the original had been ordinary, whereas actually the original, even reading it in French, was rather bizarre.
I have one who is like Agualusa, who's Juan Gabriel Vasquez, who answers my emails every day or several times a day.
And his English is excellent as well.
And his English is excellent, which is another issue. The other authors, I used to try to save up all my questions till I'd finished the first draft and had intelligent questions and only intelligent questions, and which I do with most authors, but Juan Gabriel is so trusting. I even ask him my really stupid, embarrassing questions, which I shouldn't, and I wouldn't recommend it. But Julio, he never answers me anymore.
I do save up my questions till I've done the whole first draft, if I can, because then you can put them in one largish batch, and very often a problem will solve itself as you go through the draft of a book.
Yeah.
But this, of course, I mean, all the authors I work with who are alive have been wonderful to work with.
Yeah.
My children's author, Cornelia Funke, whose own English is excellent, we have a lively correspondence going on throughout the translation of one of her books.
There are authors who almost want to perch on your shoulder and watch what you're doing, and then want you to explain to them what it is exactly that what you've said means if you've translated it back. But equally, I have had authors who, I mean, I generally will save all of my questions till the end of the first draft. I have had authors who have never replied to me, and who, even getting them through their agent, have never replied to me. On questions where actually I desperately needed to know, because there are issues of fact, or there are issues of, I mean, an Algerian novel that I did last year, where, I mean, the author did not decline to be in contact with his English publisher, or with me, or with his agent, and that was it, kind of thing.
In the case of the fourth Agualusa book, the one we've just published, because I've been keeping this blog detailing the process of translation, I discovered about halfway through that he's been reading the blog. So I've been describing what I've been doing, and basically, over the course of about 20,000 words, complaining about him online to the public. And then he mentioned in an email very casually, oh, by the way, I'm really enjoying the blog. So is my aunt.
I think one of you mentioned cadence. And I think that sounds like something very difficult to get. And I wonder how you find that balance. It sounds like a very interesting and quite intangible process.
This actually comes to the question of you're finding a new voice for every new book. You're changing yourself as far as you can into the author and looking for the English that will echo that author's own voice.
There is a line in the end of near the end of the first book I translated, which I translated it straight as it was, and it somehow didn't sound quite right, and I wasn't sure quite why it didn't sound right, and I changed the verb a little bit. I made the verb a little bit stronger, and then I turned it around. I turned the sentence around. So I inverted the whole thing, and then I thought, this sounds much better. This sounds like a proper line. This sounds like it should sound like. And then I went back to it later, after it had been published, alas, and realized that I had changed it quite a bit away from what it had originally been into something else, which was a very good line, but it was a very good line because it's from My Fair Lady. And it sounded great. And as cadences go, it had a lovely rhythm to it, and it sat very nicely on this big verb at the end. But it wasn't quite the same. It didn't have quite the same punch as the original. It's a great line. I'm quite pleased with it.